Hello, everyone. Right, so I'm Robert Teszka. I come from Vancouver in Canada, where I worked as a busker for about 2 months before I realized it was stressful and unlucrative, and then went to university, studied psychology, and came over here to do a master's and became a grad student, which is also stressful and unlucrative, but at least I don't get punched in the face anymore like I did when I... So I'm going to talk to you a little about research that I've been doing with my supervisor and an ever-increasing group of magic researchers who often have backgrounds as magicians, some who don't, and give you a little taste of how magic is useful for studying psychology and why we should be interested in it. But before that, we go back to the hoary past of psychology. This is the Kanishka triangle. There is no triangle there, but it looks like there is a triangle there. Some people even see the white inside the triangle as being more bright than the white of the background. They are, in fact, the same. There is no triangle there. It's just a bunch of Pac-Men about to attack each other in a maze. And we see things that aren't there. We experience visual illusions. And this has intrigued cognitive psychologists since the birth of psychology. It's not just that we see things that aren't there physically, we see motion that isn't there. We can see all sorts of things that aren't there, not just visual, but dynamic. Not static, but also dynamic. So why are we interested in illusions? What's the point of studying illusions? Why are they interesting to psychologists, perhaps to you? Well, if you understand where something fails, you can understand how it works. Studying illusions helps you map out the boundaries. You get a map, and that helps you navigate. So, why do we experience illusions? Why don't we see things accurately? Why do we see things that aren't there? The world is complicated. We don't have a large enough brain to take in every piece of information and accurately represent it to ourselves. So we have to take shortcuts, and you all know that. But this is sort of core to cognitive psychology. It's this assumption that we take shortcuts because we don't have enough resources. It's all about efficiency. Illusions and the experiencing of illusions is efficient, and that's interesting. So we'll start with one. Every time this picture blinks, something in it changes. If you know what it is, raise your hand and have a look around the room to see how many people are raising their hands and when. No one yet. It's something rather important to the proper functioning of an important component. Absolutely crucial. That's about half the room now. It's the engine of the airplane. It's blinking in and out of existence. And it's difficult to notice this, even though it's right there in the middle. Ron Rensink he's a psychologist and computer scientist. He was hired by Nissan, the car company, to try and understand why people were crashing into buildings and trains, even though they were visible right in front of them. And he stumbled on this idea that when there's a transient, when there's a quick blink, for example, a wiper blade, you don't notice if something really big and important changes during that blink. This doesn't just happen on blinking pictures and for people driving cars. It happens in somewhat more complicated circumstances, as this video will show. We were working with Jake Fernie there, who's a neuroscientist at UCL, on replicating a famous experiment that Dan Simons did, the door swap study. So there's me on the right, talking heads, blah, blah, blah. He is pretending to be a lost tourist, and he's asking passersby for help navigating from the market to Liverpool Street Station. And while he's doing that, he's capturing their attention with the map. We come through, sorry, excuse me, ahem, we need to get through here, and I swap places with him. And people continue talking with me as if nothing happened. We did this over and over again. We replicated the same results of Dan Simon's original study. It can happen right in front of your place. It can happen in the real world, and you don't notice it. And a lot of this stuff, the interesting thing about using magic and about illusions in general, is that you can push them into the real world. People actually do experience these in the real world when they're out and about, and it's important to try and understand that in situ. We did it over and over. It was very strange coming in mid-conversation. People would keep talking as if I was the same person, and I just sort of had to nod and go along with it. And yes, I know exactly what you're talking about. I wish I could fast forward a little, but here, we have two people now. You don't even need a real person. So we can take Jake's tall friend there and replace him with a mannequin. And it's really quite astonishing. That's when she clocked it, by the way. As soon as you look directly at the mannequin, you know something's not quite right. And this is perhaps my favorite, is at the University of Western Washington, Ira Hyman had a grad student who was also a clown, allied art, as magicians would call it, and he dressed up in full clown gear, would ride around his unicycle in figure eights, honking a horn or juggling, and they would track whether people were walking into the quad talking with a friend, alone and listening to music, or talking with someone on the phone. And the people who were talking on the phone were very unlikely to notice this garish and perhaps terrifying clown cycling around them. 4/5 of people who were talking on the phone didn't notice the clown. So all of this subfield of psychology is the study of attention and awareness, and the core takeaway from it is that if you're paying attention to one thing, you can't pay attention to something else. Attention is a limited resource. We have to take shortcuts, so we experience illusions because we're all about efficiency. And this is something that is core to a lot of magic. So why magic? Why magic in particular? Well, magicians have spent a long time, sort of by trial and error over hundreds of years, developing techniques to do the impossible in front of large groups of people, repeatedly. So there's a lot of intuition there. There's a lot of practitioner knowledge that it's useful to try and understand and mine and see what we can learn from it. Not just that, but deception is pretty standard in psychology. This is Stanley Milgram with his famous shock box, in which he asked the teacher to shock the learner in the next room if they got a question wrong. But it was actually a study of obedience, and they weren't actually shocking anyone. And the only reason this study was able to be done was that they weren't shocking anyone. Deception was core to the possibility of this study. So if we're going to create deceptive studies, we might as well design it according to some of the principles that magicians use to try and make it a little bit more subtle and perhaps more ethical. So magicians are perceptual experts. They've spent a lot of time coming through trial and error to understand these different techniques. Anthony Barnhart published a paper in which he argues that magicians sort of independently discovered all the same principles that psychologists at the turn of the century up to the 30s were discovering about how perception works, the perceptual grouping rules of Gestalt psychologists. For example, when you're taking the classic thumb trick, that works because there's a principle of continuation. We assume that thumb tip is connected to the thumb base, but that's not the case, and a lot of magic tricks take advantage of these perceptual principles. So it's worth mining some magic books to see what else we can find. It allows us to do the otherwise impossible. If you want something to change color right in front of someone's eyes, who better to ask than a magician who does that on stage in front of a different audience every night? And they do it every night, and it works. So in a world of psychology, where something is really, really great, if it works 60% of the time for a very homogeneous group of people in a lab who are sitting in front of a computer for 2 hours, it's glorious to try and find something that works for 99% of multiple different audiences in different venues every single time it's tried. This is hugely, hugely powerful. And it's out in the real world. So let's always push into the real world. And the thing about magic that particularly interests me and ties it in with attention and awareness is the concept of misdirection. This is the set of techniques that magicians use to manipulate what you're paying attention to, where you're looking, and what you can be aware of. But I always talk about putting things into the real world, so perhaps you'd like a demonstration. Thank you. just you, then. All right. This is what we in the biz like to call a packet trick, which is normally performed close-up. It just has a small packet of cards. I will try and entertain an entire room of people using 4 cards. Ace, 2, 3, and 4 of hearts. Can everyone see those all right? And if you're paying attention to the cards and not to my face, you'll be able to tell me what card I just turned face up. Was anyone paying attention? The 4. Are you sure? It's the 2, sorry. Don't take your eyes off. Although you did. I asked you a question, I looked up, bang, right to my face. You looked away from the cards. Should be the 2. There's the 3. Do not take your eyes away from the cards, sir. What card should be face up? 3. Should be the 3. Of course, it's the 4. It's not just misdirection, there's also sleight of hand. But I also have been cheating. So, here, let's make it easier. What card is face up now? Correct, by a quarter. They're all face up now. Magic is about misdirection. You've been paying attention to the faces of the cards. But does anyone remember what color the backs were? Are you sure? Thank you very much. Attention in the real world is complicated. It's hard to study. We try and do it with eye trackers. Here's my supervisor performing a trick with a cigarette. That dot represents one person's eye movements. The cigarette and the lighter both vanish. So he had this idea of, let's just put people in an eye tracker, show them some tricks, see what happens. And that created a whole area of research. We can dig into it a little now. You get these nice little bee swarms of each dot represents one person's eye movements. We overlay them on a video of this trick being performed. And notice how they cluster. Notice how easily every single person's eye movements are orchestrated by something as simple as the glances of the magician. I'll skip that. This is something important. Ignore bottom and top for now, but compare left and right. Right are the people who saw the lighter dropping. That's how it disappeared, by the way. It's just dropped, it's visible to everybody. On the left are the people who didn't notice it. Very little difference. It's hard to ignore social cues, but where you look is not necessarily where you're paying attention. There's this disconnect, which is really, really important to understand if, for example, you're using eye tracking to try and understand what people are paying attention to. I'm rapidly running out of time. The data is very messy. This is, again, pushing more into the real world. That first one you saw was on video. This one is using a real-world eye tracker, people sitting across from me live. We want to see where people actually look and how they behave and whether they notice a card color change in real life. I had prepared a 40-minute talk. Social cues are here, blah, blah, blah. Yes, there's 2 different reasons we move our eyes. Sometimes we're interested in gathering information, but sometimes we're interested in signaling to each other. Eyes aren't just tubes that we point at things we want to know about. We tell each other things with them, and this is very hard to ignore. Eyes are magic. So, the world is not as it appears to be. This is interesting. Illusions help us understand how our minds work, and that's why we want to study them. Magic is really useful for this, and misdirection in particular, if you're interested in attention and awareness. Social cues are powerful and very hard to ignore. A magician can orchestrate an entire audience with glances. Although where you're looking isn't always where you're paying attention. So do be careful. That's all I have to say. Thank you.